The signature line was empty. Diane Ashcroft kept staring at it as though it might sign itself if she waited long enough. 3 lawyers sat across the conference table without saying a word. Beyond the window, Savannah disappeared behind a curtain of gray rain. Between them rested a single manila folder, the only thing standing between Diane and losing the house she'd called home for 23 years. The strange part wasn't that a signature was missing, it was whose signature she needed. Not her son's, not her daughter's, not even her own. She needed the signature of the woman she'd spent 20 years quietly convincing herself didn't really belong in the family. Noelle Whitaker, her stepdaughter, the quiet girl who'd spent 15 years eating dinner on a folding chair, pushed into the corner while everyone else sat at the table. And now, she was the only person in the room with the power to save Diane's home. To understand why Diane Ashcroft needed Noelle Whitaker's signature that morning, you first have to understand the folding chair. Almost 20 years earlier, in a modest brick house on Habersham Street in Savannah, Georgia, a 9-year-old girl named Noelle Whitaker sat down for dinner on her first night in a new family and discovered there wasn't quite enough room for her at the table. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody said anything cruel. Diane simply set 5 plates instead of 6, realized her mistake, and then, instead of adding a 6th chair to the table, pulled a small folding chair from the hall closet and set it at the corner, slightly apart from the rest, where the table's edge met the wall. "Just for tonight," Diane said. "Until we figure out the seating." They never figured out the seating. Not that night, not the next year, not for the next 15. Noelle's father, Walter Whitaker, had married Diane 2 years after Noelle's mother passed away from a long illness that had eaten up their savings and, in its own quiet way, some of Walter's spirit along with it. Diane came into the marriage with 2 children of her own, Preston, who was 11, and Bailey, who was 7, and a firm, unspoken conviction that blended families worked best when everyone understood their place in the new arrangement. Noelle's place, it turned out, was the folding chair. She didn't complain. Even at 9 years old, she had inherited something from her father that made her watch more than she reacted, a stillness that Diane mistook, for years, for a lack of feeling. It wasn't. Noelle felt everything. She simply didn't hand anyone the satisfaction of watching her feel it. Walter noticed the chair, of course. He noticed most things, but Walter Whitaker was a man rebuilding a life out of the wreckage of grief, and there is a particular kind of exhaustion that makes a person choose peace over confrontation, even when peace comes at someone else's expense. He kept telling himself he'd fix it eventually, that Diane simply needed time to adjust. Year after year, those promises became easier to repeat than the conversation waiting quietly in the corner of his own dining room. By the time Noelle turned 12, the folding chair had become load-bearing in a different way. It wasn't about seating anymore. It was about who got asked how their day was first, who got new school shoes without a fight, and who got the hand-me-downs from a cousin 2 sizes off, who got their science fair project displayed on the refrigerator, and who got told, gently, that the refrigerator was getting a little crowded. Diane would have told you, if you'd asked her, that she loved all 3 children equally. She believed this completely. That's the part that made it so hard to see. Diane wasn't a villain twirling a mustache. She was a woman who had convinced herself that fairness and sameness were the same thing, and that if she treated Preston and Bailey the way her own instincts told her to, and treated Noelle the way a responsible guardian treats a ward, nobody could accuse her of favoritism. She just wasn't required to love Noelle the way she loved her own children. And in Diane's mind, that distinction was invisible. To Noelle, it was the only thing in the room. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being raised by people who feed you, clothe you, send you to a good school, and never once make you feel like you belong to them. It doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates, quietly, meal by meal, birthday by birthday, until a person learns to expect very little and prepare for everything. Noelle learned to prepare for everything. She got a part-time job at 14, not because the family needed money, but because she wanted her own. She kept a savings account Diane didn't know about. She learned to read a room the way some people learn to read weather. The shift in Diane's tone before a request turned into a lecture. The specific silence that meant Preston had gotten in trouble and someone else was about to be blamed for it instead. And she watched her father. Walter Whitaker ran a small but well-respected estate planning and wealth management practice out of an office 2 blocks from the Savannah waterfront. He didn't talk about work much at home, old habits from a career built on discretion. But Noel used to sit in his office on weekends, doing homework at the corner of his desk, listening to him take calls about trusts and beneficiaries, and the quiet architecture of who gets what when someone dies. She asked him once, when she was maybe 15, why people made things so complicated. Why not just leave everything to whoever you love the most? Walter had smiled at that, in the tired, patient way he smiled at most things by then. Because love isn't always obvious from the outside, sweetheart, he said. Sometimes the people who deserve the most are the ones nobody's paying attention to. A good plan protects them. It doesn't ask permission from anybody's feelings. Noelle didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. She would, eventually. It would just take her father's death to make it clear. Walter Whitaker died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, of a heart attack that gave no warning and left no room for last words. Noelle was 26. She had, by then, become exactly the kind of person the folding chair had quietly trained her to be: careful, precise, and impossible to catch off guard. She'd built a career as an estate and trust attorney in Atlanta, ironically enough, in almost the exact field her father had spent his life in. She told people it was a coincidence. It wasn't. Some part of her had spent her whole childhood trying to understand the machinery that decided who mattered and who didn't, and she'd quietly followed that question into a career. The funeral was small, tasteful, exactly the kind of restrained goodbye Walter would have wanted. Diane sat in the front row dressed in black, dignified and genuinely grieving. Whatever else could be said about Diane Ashcroft, her love for Walter had never been in question. Preston, now 33 and running a moderately successful commercial landscaping business Walter had helped finance twice over the years, sat beside her. Bailey, 29, newly married and expecting her first child, sat on Diane's other side, quietly wiping away tears. Noelle sat 1 row back. Nobody moved a program to make room for her closer to the front. Nobody thought to. 20 years of habit doesn't undo itself in a week of grief. It was, in its own way, the folding chair all over again. Only this time, there wasn't a folding chair. There didn't need to be. By now, nobody had to think about where Noelle belonged. Everyone already knew. She said nothing. She'd learned long ago that speaking up rarely changed where people expected her to sit. More often than not, it simply reminded everyone that she was sitting there at all. 3 weeks after the funeral, the family gathered in the office of Clara Ashford, Walter's longtime attorney and trusted friend. A sharp, silver-haired woman, Clara had drafted Walter's will 15 years earlier and updated it twice since. The house on Habersham Street, the modest but respectable investment portfolio Walter had built over 3 decades. The estate planning practice itself, still operating with 2 junior associates keeping the lights on. Everything rested inside a single folder. Diane assumed, reasonably, that the house would come to her outright. She'd lived there for more than 20 years. It was her home in every sense that mattered. Preston assumed, somewhat less reasonably but with complete confidence, that he'd receive a substantial cash distribution. Over the years, he'd mentioned more than once that his landscaping company had expansion plans that only needed a little more runway. Bailey expected nothing specific, only, as she'd quietly told her husband the night before, to be treated the same as everybody else. Clara Ashford adjusted her glasses, opened the folder, and began to read. The house on Habersham Street, the investment portfolio, the estate planning practice. 11 years earlier, Walter Whitaker had transferred them into the Whitaker Family Trust. Upon his death, the revocable trust automatically became irrevocable for the equal benefit of all 3 children. Diane's face went very still. She retained a life estate, the legal right to remain in the house for as long as she wished, but the house itself, every decision involving maintenance, refinancing, sale, or transfer, belonged to the trust, and the trust required a single trustee. Clara turned another page, Walter named his successor trustee 11 years ago, she said, and reaffirmed that decision 18 months before his passing. She looked toward Noelle, still, hands folded quietly in her lap, exactly the way Walter used to sit. Noelle Whitaker. The room did not erupt. Diane Ashcroft was too composed for that. Grief has a way of muting even the sharpest shock into something quieter, and far more devastating. Something shifted behind Diane's eyes, the quiet recalculation of someone realizing the ground she'd stood on for 20 years had never been as solid as she believed. "There must be some mistake," Diane said at last, her voice calm. "Noelle isn't even—" She stopped herself. "She isn't blood. She's his daughter," Clara replied simply. "And she's an estate attorney with 12 years of trust and fiduciary experience." She paused. Walter was very specific about his reasoning. "If you'd like, I can read his note." She didn't wait for permission. Some part of her, a woman who had known Walter for more than 30 years and had quietly watched this family from the outside, believed those words deserved to be heard exactly once. She unfolded the page and read, "I trust Noelle to protect what I built, and to protect the people I love, including the people who never quite made room for her. That is exactly why it has to be her, and not anyone who spent 30 years assuming it would be otherwise." Nobody spoke. Not immediately. Diane looked across the room at her stepdaughter, searching, looking for satisfaction, triumph, vindication, anything. She found nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, no quiet victory waiting to be enjoyed. Noelle simply looked back at her, calm, unreadable, the same expression she'd worn her entire life whenever the room finally noticed her, and didn't quite know what to do next. "Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever been part of a family, but never quite felt like you belonged in it? If you have, I'd really like to hear your story in the comments. I read far more of them than you probably realize, and many of the stories we tell here begin with conversations exactly like those. And if you're enjoying stories that unfold quietly before turning everything upside down, I genuinely love to have you subscribe. Because over the next 18 months, the girl who spent 15 years in a folding chair is about to become the only person everyone else has to stand up for. For the first few months, life settled into something that looked almost ordinary. On the surface, very little changed. Underneath it, everything had. Noelle, true to form, did nothing dramatic. She reviewed the trust documents, met with Clara to understand the full scope of her obligations, and quietly began the unglamorous work every trustee has to do: appraisals, tax filings, maintenance assessments on a house that, it turned out, needed considerably more upkeep than Diane had let on over the years. Diane, meanwhile, did what she'd always done whenever life refused to match the story she preferred. She rewrote the story. To her friends, to Preston and Bailey, even to herself, Walter's estate planning had simply been complicated. Noelle's role was just administrative. Nothing had really changed. Diane was still the woman of the house. Noelle was still, in Diane's mind, essentially a filing clerk with a law degree whose job was to sign whatever needed signing and otherwise stay out of the way. That comfortable fiction lasted almost exactly 10 months. It ended on a Thursday afternoon when Diane called Noelle, not to ask, but to inform her that she'd found a contractor to finally replace the house's aging roof and had already written a deposit check using estate funds. "I need you to reimburse the estate account," Noelle said calmly. "You don't have signing authority over trust assets, Diane." "Only I do." Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that arrives when someone realizes the rules they thought still applied no longer do. "I've lived in that house for 23 years, Diane finally said. "I think I'm allowed to make basic decisions about its upkeep." "You're allowed to live there," Noelle replied. "That's exactly what your life estate provides, and I intend to honor it completely. But every dollar spent on that house belongs to an asset that's held equally for Preston, Bailey, and the long-term obligations of the trust. Property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and everything else that comes with protecting it." She paused only long enough to make sure Diane heard the next part. "I can't allow anyone, including you, to spend estate funds without my approval. That's not me being difficult. It's the job Dad trusted me to do." Diane hung up without saying goodbye. 2 weeks later, Preston called. His approach was completely different, warmer, friendlier, the tone of someone who had rehearsed the conversation several times before dialing. His landscaping company had an opportunity to bid on a major municipal contract, he explained. The kind that could double the size of the business within 2 years. All he needed was a modest advance against his future inheritance. Call it a loan, he said. It's going to be mine eventually anyway. Noelle listened without interrupting. Preston had always been good at making impossible requests sound perfectly reasonable. When he finished, she answered quietly. I can't do that. Why not? It's my money. Not yet. She let the words settle before continuing. It's an asset held in trust for your benefit. The trust doesn't allow early distributions, except for documented health, education, or housing necessity. A business expansion doesn't qualify. And even if it did, I have a fiduciary responsibility to protect the entire trust, not just your share of it. Preston's voice lost its practiced warmth. You're really going to lecture me about fiduciary duty? You've been part of this family for what, 20 years? And the first time you get any actual power, this is what you do with it? Noelle waited. Not because she needed time to think, because silence often gave people a chance to hear themselves. I'm doing exactly what Dad asked me to do, she said. Protect it. For all three of us. That includes protecting it from decisions that feel urgent today and would look like mistakes 5 years from now. The call ended without another word. For the first time in his life, someone had told Preston Whitaker no, and meant it. 3 days later, Bailey called. Her approach was different again. She wasn't armed with legal arguments or business projections. She was holding her infant son during a video call. She spoke about sleepless nights, new expenses, the uncertainty of becoming a first-time mother. Mostly, she appealed to family. Surely, she said, Noelle understood what it felt like to need a little more breathing room. Listening to Bailey, Noelle realized something that would have surprised the 9-year-old girl who once sat in the folding chair. She wasn't angry. That surprised her. She'd imagined this moment differently for years. She thought it would feel like justice. Instead, it felt like responsibility. These weren't cruel people. Not really. They were people who had spent most of their lives without anyone in a position to tell them no. Now someone finally could. Power hadn't changed Noelle. It had simply revealed the kind of person she'd already become. I love you, Bailey, she said gently, and I mean that. You're not asking for anything unreasonable as a sister, but you're asking something I can't approve as trustee. I'm not going to release trust funds outside the terms Dad left. Not for you. Not for Preston. Not for Diane. If I bend the rules once, they stop being rules. They become my opinion. And opinions change depending on who's asking the hardest. Bailey looked down for a long moment. She didn't argue. She simply nodded. The call ended quietly. For the second time in less than a month, someone had accepted an answer they didn't want, because somewhere beneath the disappointment, they knew it was the right one. The real crisis arrived almost a year later, not with an argument, not with another phone call, with numbers. A property tax reassessment valued the house on Habersham Street nearly 40% higher than it had been just a year before, driven by the neighborhood's rapid gentrification. The new tax bill alone would have strained the estate, but it wasn't the tax assessment that turned strain into crisis. It was the roof. The roof Diane had tried to replace without authorization the previous year had, in the meantime, developed a serious leak. When inspectors finally opened it up, they discovered structural water damage spreading through the framing beneath it. Left alone another 2 or 3 years, the entire west wing of the house would be at risk. The repair estimate was staggering. Combined with the new tax assessment and the trust's ongoing obligations, the numbers no longer worked. Something had to give. Noelle laid out the only 3 paths the trust allowed at the first family meeting she had ever called herself. They could liquidate part of the investment portfolio, reducing the eventual inheritance for all 3 beneficiaries. They could secure a home equity line against the property itself, accepting the long-term financial risk that came with it. Or, they could sell the house, invest the proceeds, and use part of the funds to provide Diane with alternative housing under the terms of her life estate. It was the option Noelle least wanted to mention. Professional responsibility required her to. Diane went pale. Whatever complicated feelings she carried toward Noelle, the house had never been just another asset. It was 23 years of birthdays, the back porch where Walter had proposed on a warm October evening. The walls that had watched her children grow up. Losing it would feel like losing Walter all over again. You wouldn't, Diane whispered. For the first time in Noelle's memory, the certainty was gone. Fear had taken its place. I don't want to, Noelle answered honestly. But my responsibility isn't to protect memories, it's to protect the trust. I have to consider what's sustainable, not only what's sentimental. That applies to everyone in this room, including me. The room fell quiet, then Preston spoke, slowly, carefully. There's a fourth option. Everyone looked at Preston, including Preston. You could authorize an early partial distribution, just enough to cover the repairs and the tax gap. Bailey and I take it from our future shares. Diane keeps the house. The trust stays intact. We take the loss early. Silence settled across the room again. Noelle realized she had just witnessed the first genuinely selfless thing either of her half-siblings had offered in longer than she could remember. I'd still need Bailey's agreement, she said quietly. It affects her interest just as much as yours. Bailey looked down at her little boy, then back at Noelle. Do it. She's still my mom. I'm not going to let a spreadsheet decide where she grows old. And so, 11 months after the reassessment, the family found themselves back inside Clara Ashford's conference room. Not for another argument, not for another reading of the trust, but for the signatures required to authorize an early, unequal distribution voluntarily proposed by Preston and Bailey and legally approved only by Noelle. Diane sat across the table from her stepdaughter. For the first time in 20 years, she had no authority left to shape what happened next. She couldn't authorize the repairs. She couldn't overrule the trustee. She couldn't appeal to seniority, or habit, or the quiet assumption that she'd always known best. She needed Noelle's signature, and Noelle needed nothing at all from her. For 20 years, Diane had decided where Noelle sat. Now, only Noelle could decide whether Diane stayed. Clara Ashford slid the final authorization across the polished conference table. Nobody reached for it. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Diane looked down at the document. Then, slowly, she looked at Noelle. Really looked at her. Perhaps for the first time since Walter had brought a frightened 9-year-old girl home all those years ago. For the first time in more than 20 years, Diane wasn't looking at her stepdaughter as an obligation. She was looking at the only person who could decide what happened next. Why are you doing this? Diane asked quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a defense. It was as close as Diane Ashcroft had ever come to an honest question. You don't owe me anything. She stopped. You never did. Another silence settled between them. And I know that better than anyone. Noelle didn't answer immediately. She considered the question the way her father always had, patiently, never rushing words that mattered. Finally, she spoke. Because Dad didn't put me here to punish anyone. He put me here to protect what mattered to him. And whether any of us expected it or not, that included you. It included Preston. It included Bailey. She paused. I spent years believing the folding chair meant I didn't belong in this family. Eventually, I realized something. It wasn't that I didn't belong. It was that nobody had learned how to make room. Those are two very different things. She looked gently toward Diane. I'm not doing this so you'll owe me something. I'm doing it because it's the right decision under the terms Dad left behind, and because Preston and Bailey chose fairness when it mattered most. Dad trusted me to protect this family. Sometimes, protecting a family means protecting people from themselves. That matters to me more than you probably realize. Diane's eyes filled. For once, she didn't try to hide it. I should have pulled up another chair. It wasn't quite an apology. It wasn't quite forgiveness. It wasn't even a sentence that neatly repaired 20 years. But it was the closest Diane Ashcroft had ever come. 20 years? And one crisis. Too late. You should have, Noelle answered simply. She didn't soften the words. She didn't need to. Some truths arrive gently. Others deserve to land exactly as they are. Noelle picked up the pen. She signed her name. The The repairs were approved. The house was saved. Not by revenge, not by anger, not by the loudest voice in the room, but by the quiet authority of the little girl who once ate dinner on a folding chair in the corner. Nobody had ever made room for her at the table, so she built a life where she no longer needed permission to sit down. The roof was repaired 4 months later. The house stayed standing. In some quieter way, so did the family. Diane stayed in a rental nearby while the work was completed, every expense approved by Noelle without hesitation, because that too was simply the right decision under the terms Walter had left behind. What changed between Diane and Noelle wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was something smaller, respect, the kind that grows slowly after people finally begin seeing each other clearly. Diane began asking Noelle's opinion on things, not the polite performance of inclusion she'd offered for years, her actual opinion. Noelle, in turn, quietly started coming to Sunday dinners again. She had stopped attending sometime in her 20s. No one had ever mentioned it. The first Sunday she returned, Diane had already set the table. 6 places, the chairs matched. There was no folding chair waiting in the corner. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody needed to. Noelle sat where she'd always deserved to sit. Dinner unfolded the way ordinary family dinners do. A little noisy, a little imperfect, entirely ordinary. It was exactly the kind of ordinary Noelle had spent her childhood wishing for. Months later, Preston won the municipal contract he'd once hoped to finance with trust money. He never needed the loan. Over coffee one afternoon, he smiled sheepishly. "I'm glad you said no. I would have overextended myself. You saw that before I did." For the first time, Noelle realized being trusted felt very different from finally being noticed. Bailey's son spent nearly every summer at the house on Habersham Street. He slept in the bedroom that had once belonged to Noelle. He played in the same backyard. He wandered the same creek that ran behind the property. No one had ever taught Noelle to swim. She'd figured it out alone. She decided he never would have to. The summer he turned 6, she walked beside him into the water herself. Diane watched quietly from the back porch, the same porch where Walter had once asked her to marry him. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer advice. She simply watched. Some people spend years trying to earn a place in a family. Others spend just as many years learning how to make room. There's something nobody tells you about power when you're the child sitting in the folding chair, watching everyone else get served first. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with applause. And it almost never comes with an apology. It simply finds you one day, quietly, after years of watching, learning, waiting, and when it finally arrives, it asks only one question, not, who did you love the loudest? Who did you make room for before you had any reason to? Diane Ashcroft spent 20 years believing the answer to that question didn't matter. She assumed nobody was paying attention. She was wrong. She thought nobody was keeping score. She never realized the folding chair had been keeping it all along. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone you've known, or maybe even someone you used to be, I'd really love to hear your story in the comments. I read far more of them than you probably realize, and many of the stories we tell here begin with conversations exactly like those. And if stories about family, quiet choices, and the moments that shape us long before anyone notices are the kind you enjoy, I'd genuinely love to have you subscribe. There are many more waiting for you. Until the next story, take care of the people who never had a seat at the table, because one day they may be the only person left with the power to decide where everyone else belongs.